Vietnam had tariffs on us of around 45%. So Trump said, okay, we'll put 45% tariffs back on you. Sounds fair, right? Well, it's not fair. It's actually it's a much bigger tariff on Vietnam than it is on the United States. So not only is the United States hitting back, they're hitting back tenfold. And I'll tell you how. Because Vietnam sends $1 billion worth of, or like $100 billion worth of goods to the United States every year. The United States sends like $4 billion worth of goods to Vietnam. So if you got 45% on each one of them, that's $2 billion that's now put on the United States. That's a lot of money, but in the overall scheme of things for the United States, $2 billion isn't that big a deal. But that's $45 billion that Vietnam has to eat. $45 billion for Vietnam is a huge astronomical number. The milkshake comes from the idea that when you get into a crisis, fiscal authorities, monetary authorities, central banks, governments, however you want to define the powers that be, typically respond to a crisis by injecting more liquidity, doing stimulus, bailouts, quantitative easing, again, however you want to describe these extraordinary monetary policies to counteract the crisis that we're in. That's the mixing of the milkshake. But for various reasons that I've laid out over time, I thought the U.S. has the biggest straw. And so that milkshake gets mixed. The U.S. sucks that capital up into the United States, and the United States drinks the milkshake that the world has. That's a summary of the thesis. And it's kind of a silly way to explain the mechanics of the monetary system. But it's really helped me and my clients kind of navigate the last 5 or 6 years. And it's kept us from getting hurt along the way and making money when things are good. So,
what's the current situation? I hate asking the question, but what's the state of the economy? What's the state of the financial system right now? Where we're at?
Well, the interesting thing is that all of the volatility that's happening in the world right now is very much self-inflicted by Trump trying to realign the world order and the rest of the world's reaction to Trump trying to realign the world order. And what Trump is trying to do from a very simple perspective is change the way the United States has done business for the last 50 or 60 years. But I think we can also agree that this is not the ideal circumstance to be doing this in. So what I would say is prior to Trump getting elected, everything on the surface was in a pretty good spot. But the reason that he's trying to change things is because under the surface, it wasn't. And what I mean by that is if you zoom out and you look at the United States and you look at its trajectory, asset prices were still rising and the economy was still growing, but it was largely based on the stock market and asset prices. It wasn't necessarily Main Street and Joe Sixpack, for lack of a better word. Inequality was continuing to grow. The trade deficit was continuing to grow. The budget deficit was continuing to grow. And I've been doing this for 25 years now. And from the moment I started in this business until now, every year the knock on the United States has been that they run these dual deficits and the inequality problem is getting worse. And, the Main Street's been left behind. I mean, literally every year for as long as I've been in business, I've heard that. So Trump is very much doing what he campaigned on. Nobody should be surprised by what he's doing other than the fact that it's a politician's doing what he said he was going to do. Right. And so and I don't really know if you were going to solve those problems, if you were going to solve the problems of the good, manufacturing jobs leaving the United States and wages getting depressed and inequality growing and the middle and lower class getting left behind. If you are going to solve those problems, I don't really know how else you do it other than what's being done. And even under the best of circumstances, that's going to be a very volatile process. And I think we've only I by no means do I think we're at the end. It may be the end of the beginning, but I think it's really just getting started. I think it's actually what he says it is. And I think the plan is America first. Now, again, put aside whether you think that's the good goal or not. But what's a little different now as opposed to before is you could say, sure, the United States always wanted to put America first. And perhaps that's true, even though they were doing it under a different strategy. But it was never all coordinated by all different factions within the government at the same time. And with Trump coming in, he's kind of consolidating all of these different departments, all these different agencies, all these different arms of the government into pulling towards the exact same goal. And I think that goal is exactly what he says it is. The reestablishment or the reinvention or the, putting American interests before global interests. But I think in many ways, this is real life. This is, behind the scenes. This is the global hegemon saying, we're no longer going to hold this veil of altruism that it's for the greater good. From now on, if it's not for the betterment of the United States, we're not doing it. We're not paying for it. And if that hurts you, too bad. Now, I know that sounds even harsh, me saying it. So I know it sounds even more harsh when Trump says it, right? But that's the reality that I have to deal with. And I think that's the reality that the rest of the world is slowly coming to grips with. And as a result, I think it's going to cause a realignment. And in some ways, it's going to cause countries to actually cooperate more with the United States. It will cause other countries who used to cooperate with the United States not to cooperate with the United States. And it will cause those who were an enemy of the United States to probably entrench themselves even more on the other side, which is a very long way of saying, I think volatility is kind of here to stay for a while. So in other words, an initial uncertainty and volatility, U.S. assets and the U.S. dollar often fall because it's a source of liquidity. But when and if it becomes a crisis, then the U.S. dollar usually rises. I don't think that they want a crisis. I think they're okay with everything that has happened so far, but they don't want a global depression. They don't want a global crisis because then lots of things happen that may be out of their control. But what they do want is the rest of the world under pressure as they negotiate these new tariffs. So I think the plan, if there is a plan, the plan is largely geared towards this big battle between the United States and China. In order for the United States to stay the global hegemon and to stay the sole superpower, it has to stop China's ascendancy, right? And again, it all goes back to all the debt in the world. And this is why I started thinking about this stuff back in late 2010s. Because debt has consequences. And it's not just the United States who has a lot of debt. Germany has a lot of debt. France has a lot of debt. Italy has a lot of debt. Australia has a lot of debt. Canada has a lot of debt. China, Japan, you go on and on and on. And one of the ways that countries have always dealt with internal debt problems for time immemorial is to blame the bad foreigner who caused this to happen to us, right? And that's the way they rally domestic support against the evil guy over there. And I think those dynamics are in many ways playing out. And I think that Trump and Bessent and Hegseth and his whole team knows that there's a battle coming. And I think they know that in order to be ready for that battle, they need to make sure their homeland and their home base is secure before any of that stuff starts to happen. And so I think they're trying to get their house in order so that they can withstand any future battle that comes. And I think that has to do, and I think that's part of the reason you're seeing, them talk about Greenland. You're seeing them talk about the Panama Canal. You've seen great overtures to partner with El Salvador. They've even started talking to Venezuela about potentially lightening up some sanctions there in order to get the oil flowing. I think in many ways, it's, if you're not familiar with the Monroe Doctrine, that's about 100 years old. And it basically said anything that happens in the Western Hemisphere, the United States is going to be involved in it. So I kind of feel like this is, Fortress America, for lack of a better word. And they're trying to get their whole homeland and the whole Western Hemisphere kind of under their influence in a very strong way so that they can counteract any overtures from China, Russia, and its allies. And I think this is the first time that I can remember where you have the U.S. kind of proactively realigning things in a very coordinated manner from trade, monetary policy, fiscal policy, military strategy, trade strategy. I can't remember a time where everything was as coordinated as it is now. And I'll say, and talk to other people about this, and they said, well, Brent, you're giving them too much credit. Trump is not this smart. Well, I would say, if you believe that, I think you're doing yourself a disservice, because I think this is what they're doing. And whether you like them or not, Hegseth is a smart guy, and he's in a very powerful position. And Bessent is a very smart guy, and he knows finance and he knows global finance. And believe me, it's not a surprise to them that the stock market is down, and it's not a surprise to them that volatility has risen. I think the volatility rising is part of their strategy. But this isn't some super secret complicated strategy. I think it really is as simple as what Trump says and trying to keep America at the top. And this is where the leverage comes in, which I think nobody in negotiation has ever been trying to leverage the consumer market of the United States before. But the United States is either the number one or two biggest client for every exporting country in the world. And I don't know any businesses in the world, whether they're American businesses or European business or Chinese businesses, that if they lose their one or two biggest client, their revenue isn't severely impacted. So the US knows that all the global exporters are trying to sell into the United States market because we pay the most and we buy the most. And we send them dollars, which they need to service their US dollar debt that they have. There's a huge US dollar debt outside the United States. And the reason is because for the most important countries, putting reciprocal tariffs on is a leveraged way to hit back at them. And so I'm going to use an example of Vietnam. Vietnam had tariffs on us of around 45%. So Trump said, okay, we'll put 45% tariffs back on you. Sounds fair, right? Well, it's not fair. It's actually it's a much bigger tariff on Vietnam than it is on the United States. So not only is the United States hitting back, they're hitting back tenfold. And I'll tell you how. Because Vietnam sends $1 billion worth like $100 billion worth of goods to the United States every year. The United States sends like $4 billion worth of goods to Vietnam. So if you got 45% on each one of them, that's $2 billion that's now put on the United States. That's a lot of money, but in the overall scheme of things for the United States, $2 billion isn't that big a deal. But that's $45 billion that Vietnam has to eat. $45 billion for Vietnam is a huge astronomical number. If those tariffs were to stay like that, it would put Vietnam into a depression. There's no way they could absorb $45 billion worth of losses a year. And that is why within a couple of days of these being announced, Vietnam said, hey, we want to do a trade deal with you. We want to figure something out, because that is a death blow. Now, $2 billion it's like a punch in the nose for the United States. It's not that it doesn't hurt. It's not that it isn't meaningful, but it's not cutting your head off the way it would be for Vietnam. And so that's the type of leverage that the United States consumer markets have against businesses around the world that are trying to sell into it. And it's a real thing.
We have so many topics still to cover. You touched on BRICS and the de-dollarization topic and potential alternative currency. Let's quickly talk about that. Like, how do you see that developing? Because you brought up Trump threatening the BRICS. Pretty much whoever thinks about an alternative currency to the U.S. will get heavily tariffed, was something he said a while ago. I haven't heard him say anything in that regard again since. So I'm curious what your take on that is.
You know, I've been very critical of the whole BRICS currency idea. And to be clear, I'm not critical of the countries themselves. The countries themselves are big, important, powerful countries. But the idea that this handful of countries are going to, form this super cohesive union and going to issue a common courtesy or a common currency that they all agree to use, and then they're going to be able to enforce that on all of their subjects and companies. I think people who believe that don't understand how currency markets work. And what I would say is the process of so money in the financial system that we have now, money is loaned into existence. So the way the US dollar has spread throughout the world is by the extension of credit. So if you are going to reverse that and de-dollarize, what that means is you are going to deleverage. So that means you are either going to pay off all those debts that you have, or you're going to default on all those debts that you have. One way or the other, de-dollarization is deleveraging. And in a deleveraging, the currency involved typically rises. So I think that we are headed towards some kind of an event which forces some kind of a new system or a reset or a debt jubilee or some kind of event that deals with all the debt. But I don't think that process happens with the dollar going lower. I think that process happens with the dollar going higher. And in fact, I think it's the dollar going higher that forces the currency that to happen. If the dollar falls, that means it's getting cheaper, and it means it's in high supply. If there's no supply of dollars, then the dollar would rise. But if there's plenty of supply of dollars, that means more dollars are being created. But more dollars being created means more dollar loans are being created. And so while in the short term it provides relief, in the medium to long term it just creates more demand for dollars. And I think this whole euro dollar system is a monster that got away from all the central banks, and it's grown to such a problem that it is now a Gordian knot that they just don't know how to solve. And in my opinion, in the same way that the only way the Gordian knot got broken apart was, Alexander the Great cut it in half and kind of blew it up. I kind of think that's the only way to solve this Gordian knot as well. And I think in that big explosion, I think the dollar probably goes higher before it goes lower.
Do you think the U.S. will have a problem to refinance itself?
No. And so let me tell you why. The reason they won't have trouble financing themselves is if they have to, they can just have the Fed do it, right? Now, does that contribute to inflationary pressures? Yeah, it contributes to inflationary pressures, but it contributes problems to the whole world as well. This isn't a uniquely an American situation. And so let's say that interest rates on U.S. Treasuries goes higher. Let's say that they don't do QE. Nobody buys the bonds and interest rates go from 4% to 6%. Okay, so now you have to remember that all the financial institutions in the world, all the central banks, all the insurance companies, as a core piece of their balance sheet, they own U.S. Treasuries. Their assets are now impaired on their balance sheet. So the U.S. Treasury prices going down and interest rates going higher affects the global banking system. That's number one. The other thing is that if you can get paid 6% for holding a treasury, why would you buy an Italian treasury paying 6%? Or why would you buy an Egyptian treasury paying 8%? The point I'm getting to is if you can get 6% for owning a treasury, it forces the rest of the world to pay even more to compete for that liquidity. And so the U.S. interest rates going higher, while definitely a problem for the United States, it eventually becomes an even bigger problem for the rest of the world as they have to refinance at higher rates as well. And this kind of goes back to Trump too, with Trump and Vance and Hegseth all saying that NATO the NATO countries have to start paying for more of their own defense, and they're going to have to help pay for the Ukraine war with Russia. That's going to cause budget deficits in Europe to explode. And maybe not Germany so much because they're in better situation than Portugal, Italy, Spain, Greece. A lot of European countries, Lagarde is going to have to buy those bonds. I think it's on, or those interest rates are going to rise quite a bit. So I don't think that this is a situation, and I want to make this very clear. I'm not saying the U.S. is in great shape, and I'm not saying the U.S. doesn't have tremendous problems. They have incredible problems and incredible challenges, but I don't think that they're uniquely American. I think the world is struggling with all this stuff. I just happen to think that while the world, including the United States, struggles with all this stuff, the United States have some advantages and some tools the rest of the world just doesn't have. A lot of people have talked about the potential social issues in the United States causing disruption socially in the United States, and that would be bad for the United States. But I think that same thing could happen in Europe for much of the same reasons that you just said. And I think the same thing can happen in other countries. In Canada, there's great dissension between Western Canada and Eastern Canada. Albertans don't feel like they've been treated particularly great by the government in Eastern Canada. So I think this is all part of the fourth turning. Again, it's not uniquely American. It's kind of happening all over the world.
One last one, and
Go ahead.
U.S. dollar, gold, and bonds seem to be the only tier one assets left standing. Last week, that was put into doubt a little bit because bonds went down, meaning bond yields shot up, and the U.S. dollar declined massively. Gold was the only one left standing here. Question is now, it used to be the stable pillars of safe haven investing, as I said, these three assets here. What should the common investor do now moving forward? Like, what can we trust in?
I would say that I do not think bonds are safe anymore. And this was the genesis. My belief that bonds would no longer be safe was the genesis of the dollar milkshake theory. Remember, the whole genesis of the milkshake theory was that I thought the 40-year bond bull market was coming to an end and interest rates would rise. I don't think that the U.S. is going to have trouble selling bonds, but it doesn't mean they might not have to have higher interest rates to sell them. But what I don't think will happen, I don't think we would have a situation where nobody would fund the United States government, but they would still continue to fund Canada or Mexico or France or Italy or Japan or wherever it was. So I think a sovereign debt crisis becomes a global sovereign debt crisis very quickly. I don't think it will just be one country. So that leaves gold, right? And I think everybody should absolutely own gold. That was always kind of one of the things I said during the initial part of the milkshake theory was gold would be the ultimate winner and that gold would outperform fiat currencies. Now, having said all that, if I was in Europe and I saw the rally in the euro over the last month or two, I would see that as a gift because I would get out of the euro and I would be holding either dollars or Swiss francs. Now, I'm not telling people that's what they should do. I'm just telling you what I would do because I think that the United States, despite all the problems, the whole world still needs dollars. Until they reconcile all the US dollar debt, the world still needs dollars. The whole world doesn't need euros. The whole world doesn't need yen. The whole world doesn't need yuan or rubles or lira, but they do need dollars. So, and that's why I always said that we would eventually get to a point in the milkshake where the dollar would rise and gold would rise together versus all the other currencies. And I think we're probably there now. I think if I was going to own gold now, I still own gold. I think everybody should own gold. If you don't own any gold, you should probably go buy some gold. I think gold will perform better in other currencies than it will in the dollar. But I think even if you're a US dollar investor, you should still own gold.